The imposing palace trembles with the sounds of swords. A woman is sitting there, praying incessantly. She begs the omniscient and generous one to embrace her without any pain, and finally allow her to leave this world. Edel Lancaster wished to maintain her faith in divine providence and endure, but the doors were already open. The pain, although ephemeral like a light gust of wind, left its mark on the soul. However, the fruits of patience proved truly sweet. The knights were ordered to find her. Only one room remained. As soon as they broke down the door, the protagonist saw a crowd of knights led by a man in a red cloak. She, however, awaited them calmly. Sitting in the center of the room, there was no trace of fear on her face. The knights sketched a malicious smile. The rumors did not lie, and that woman was truly beautiful. Despite the chaos, she was still acting like a duchess. The man in the red cloak addressed Duchess Edel Lancaster. He had dark hair and a fine beard on his face. With a calm and dispassionate voice, Edel asked if he was going to execute her right there. But by imperial order, the count had to capture her alive. The protagonist wondered when everything had gone wrong. Sitting on that old worn-out chair and confessing her guilt, she reflected on honor and the dignity of a noble. Edel endured all this with foolishness for foolishness, but she couldn't even die as she wished. The impeccable Lady Edel Lancaster, whom 3 years ago everyone admired, she managed to briefly become the Duchess of Lancaster. Initially, the ladies considered this engagement repulsive. The Lancasters were one of the 4 influential families. However, marrying such an elderly duke was simply horrifying, and the aristocrats constantly discussed it among themselves. But Edel remained inflexible. Many couldn't figure out what she was thinking. There are 4 families of immense power in the empire, and Edel was educated and prepared from childhood to join one of them in marriage. Now she has finally fulfilled her destiny. Who could imagine that Edel would end up being the tool to unite 2 families? But due to the duke's treacherous plan, she became the wife of a traitor. And now, the emperor was happy to have finally obtained the main trophy of this war. The duke's second wife was now in his hands. The heroine had been raised her entire life with a single purpose. Edel collapsed where she was because she was so afraid to flee that she couldn't bear the idea of dying on the floor. That's why she dragged an old chair to sit on. The aristocrats immediately began asking the king to hand the traitor over to them. They offered to forgive the elderly widower and decide the fate of the prisoner through a duel, so that someone could claim this beauty. It seems no one here has retained their dignity. Now Edel Lancaster was just a slave. The great Emperor Marcus Tuberin raised a crystal glass with expensive red wine and let out a cheerful laugh. He almost forgot the protagonist who suppressed the rebellion. The ruler asked Laszlo if he needed that woman. If Count Chrysis wished it, the emperor could give her to him. But his face remained serious. Lady Edel married the wrong man, and now she has fallen. People did not understand why the emperor wanted to grant that main trophy of war to a commoner. As much as the protagonist remembered, the count had been a mercenary in the past. However, now he was indistinguishable from any other knight. Laszlo Chrysis was the head of the largest mercenary guild in the empire. He was a man who, at only 27 years old, became a count through military merit before the great empire. For those of noble birth, Laszlo was the greatest threat. Among the new nobility on the emperor's side, he was considered the most dangerous. However, nobles, who viewed mercenaries as scum, looked at him with disdain and treated him with indifference like a commoner. Now, Laszlo looked at the prisoner sternly. The protagonist looked away to the side. The count informed His Majesty that he was not sure about his proposal. Edel's eyes widened in astonishment and perplexity when, indifferently, he added that furthermore, he lacked maids on his property. The emperor laughed heartily upon learning that Laszlo wanted to make the former duchess a servant. But the count had no other use for her. Marcus Tuberin praised such a decision. Before all those present, Edel Lancaster was granted to Count Laszlo Chrysis, who needed maids. Was this the reward for her patience? In the past, Edel's mother ordered her to stop contradicting her father. But the young lady did not want to marry someone older than her father. However, the woman clarified that there was no better match, since this man already had a mistress and adult heirs. Upon his death, Edel could receive a large inheritance. But the daughter understood nothing at all. By becoming the Duchess of one of the most influential families of this empress, she would gain so much power that even her own father would have to bow to her. The protagonist's eyes widened. She begged her father to listen to her. But the man considered it a dishonor, since the daughter did not want to strive for her family, who had already gone through so much for it. The count has done so much for someone as useless as her. Tears formed in Edel's eyes. This way, she could get rid of such a father and leave the house of Count Canyon forever. This single idea was what allowed Edel to endure. But she often had to endure ridicule and hurtful words behind her back. She was entrusted with managing dozens of records and 100 servants, but she kept enduring. Edel received guests daily and organized long events. She endured but never made a mistake. She played her part with a smile on her face. All this was for the moment of freedom that would someday arrive. Until one day, the butler burst into the room and asked her to escape. Then, Edel learned of the arrival of the imperial army. Now she knew about the secret plan that had failed. The protagonist ran at full speed through a huge deserted corridor, without seeing any palace servants anywhere. Then Edel understood that she had only been bait to delay the knights. The protagonist desired a completely different life. A life full of warmth and human kindness. But despite everything Edel had done for that duchy, only the butler told her to flee. As her father wished, she became an impeccable lady. Perhaps all that suffering had been a divine sign. Although she was called a trophy, she actually became a common slave. Although it had been abolished in the empire long ago, the daughters of the Duke of Lancaster were outraged that she continued to build something so noble. Lorna, the count's eldest daughter, deeply hated that influential figure. Daria Lancaster, the second daughter, screamed that it had been like this from the beginning. They were convinced that their father's ex-wife was secretly helping Count Canyon. And Edel had no choice but to remain silent and endure everything. The girl called her an ungrateful creature. Hearing derogatory words was nothing new. But never before had it been so rude from the Duke's daughters. It seemed they had simply exhausted their patience and decided to give up. Edel had no intention of wasting her strength on useless arguments. She knew that an instant would come when surveillance relaxed. So the protagonist had to conserve her strength. At least to die. Better to die than live like a toy. Count Chrysis said he would take her as a servant. But the young prisoner doubted she could expect humane treatment from those stronger than her. Although Edel was a prisoner, they placed her in a good prison. However, her whole body screamed in pain, and her head ached. The protagonist decided to take a nap in the hope that after resting, good ideas would come to her head. She had to figure out how to take her own life. The night passed, and finally, over the castle with its high towers and fortified walls, the sun began to rise again. Edel slowly opened her eyes and sat up. Despite the fatigue, she woke up at her usual time. According to the imperial mandate, they should hand the protagonist over, finally, to Count Chrysis. So she urgently needed to look for a chance to die. That meant it was Edel's last morning alive. The celestial light passing through the prison window seemed to bid her farewell, filling the stone cell with a soft glow. The sky looked beautiful today. The last meal was luxurious for a criminal. As soon as the Duke's daughters were ordered out of the prison, the protagonist prayed that they would be well. Then the guard allowed Edel out. Even though she was dying, she maintained her dignity. Upon stepping out onto the street, where the sun's rays bathed the earth in light, the protagonist immediately made the decision to jump directly from the carriage. That could work perfectly. If she was lucky, death would be instantaneous. The protagonist fervently hoped that she would be assigned an inexperienced driver. and thus she could achieve her purpose. But all her hopes faded when Edel saw the Count. Now she recognized her complete powerlessness. The carriage, decorated with intricate designs and shining metallic details, rushed along the road. Laszlo, with his arms crossed, looked out the window. The protagonist did not expect this man to appear in person. She assumed the Count would just want to follow her, and perhaps even try to talk to her. The woman was sure that he clearly did not like her. Suddenly, the Count unfastened his red cloak and handed it to the protagonist. She did not understand the reasons for such behavior at all. So Laszlo asked her to stop trembling now. Edel didn't even notice it. When pulling the object towards herself, she reflected, if she threw this coat at him, maybe she could buy time to jump from the moving cart. Then everything would definitely end under the wheels of the passing carriage. The sound of the cart approaching could already be heard. Counting to 3, the woman decided to open the door and jump, so she slowly began to count backward in her mind. But the Count coldly said not to even think about it. Edel was shocked. This man knew everything. That's why he got into the same cart with her. And now the protagonist was sure he wouldn't leave her in peace. Near evening, they arrived at the place. Laszlo was the first to get out of the cart. The protagonist looked at the place that would be her new hell, where she would have to live from now on. The Count watched the woman and waited for her to get out. As she took a step, Edel immediately felt pain in her ankle. Losing balance, the young woman started to fall, unable to grab onto anything. But the impact with the ground did not occur. It took Edel a moment to realize that she was now in the man's arms. Laszlo caught her, something the protagonist did not expect at all. So now she was confused. Her eyes immediately widened. She had been educated that a lady should always behave properly, and falling into someone's arms was inappropriate. She immediately moved away, hoping the Count would not misunderstand her reaction, and apologized for her behavior. Laszlo immediately withdrew his hand. Heading to the manor, he ordered them to follow him. Laszlo entered and immediately asked the housekeeper if everything was in order during his long absence. A female voice was immediately heard. The housekeeper replied that the property was in safe hands, and there was nothing to worry about. Edel was surprised that there was no butler. The Count remembered that the woman lacked maids, so he brought reinforcements and asked her to assign her somewhere. First of all, she needed to bathe and rest in the assigned room, and tomorrow she could start working. Edel was surprised that he hadn't ordered her to share his bed. Rather, he had truly brought her as if she were a servant. A maid named Mina immediately ran to Mrs. Bogian and told her that she had found out something from the knights. It turned out that this woman was the fallen Duchess of Lancaster. The head maid's eyes widened. Who could imagine that they would now have a real duchess under their direct command? Mrs. Bogian immediately asked Mina to take that woman to the furthest room. Meanwhile, the head maid decided to think for now where to assign this very pretty girl. It was kind enough of them to bring Edel food and even give her spare clothes. Now, the protagonist was expected to live in a small room. The situation spoke volumes. She was no longer an aristocrat. Edel felt cold and suspected that they simply didn't have hot water there. She would have to bathe with cold water, even in the harshest winters. It was strange, because the Count's financial situation shouldn't be that bad. But Edel decided not to ask questions about it. Now it was best to focus on her new life. It was surprising and even a little paradoxical that in her difficult situation, Edel felt like eating. It was delicious, since Edel didn't expect to taste fruit ever again. Edel wanted to die simply, because she did not wish to become a toy to satisfy dirty desires. Perhaps she would be lucky and Count Chrysis would not touch her. Edel just wanted to live in peace and enjoy the sweetness of fruits. But it was completely impossible to know if she would really manage to lead a simple life as a housekeeper. But now Edel had to survive, and only then might she find peace in her soul. The counselor, with a serious expression, informed His Majesty that Count Cruz had taken the prisoner today. But the emperor didn't even doubt it. He was interested in knowing the counselor's opinion. Marcus Tuberin asked if Count Cruz seemed satisfied. But the counselor, confused, replied that he was not sure. Others didn't even suspect the true nature of Laszlo's. He signed a contract with the emperor to join the internal forces, although Laszlo only joined for the reward. Thanks to his mercenary army, he achieved countless victories. Then the emperor allowed him to ask for whatever he wanted. However, Laszlo reported that he only needed the reward specified in the contract. That bold and brazen attitude of the mercenary made him the perfect candidate to be the emperor's faithful dog. But to tame a hound, the perfect bait is needed. A title would not be enough. As soon as Laszlo became a count, all the aristocrats began to murmur, displeased with His Majesty's decision. They did not understand their ruler's action. At that reception, Laszlo was the protagonist ignored by everyone. However, the emperor noticed that throughout the evening, the count's gaze only fixed on one woman. Undoubtedly, Edel Lancaster. The die has been cast, and now all that remains is to watch. Laszlo was furious, not understanding the emperor's intentions at all. And besides, he didn't really believe he would end up involved with that duchess. He accepted the title to marry his sister into a good family. Although Laszlo suddenly became noble, the disdain towards him, both as a commoner and a mercenary, had not disappeared. It was clear to the man how he would be treated in the marriage market. After observing for a while, Laszlo understood that the nobility's marriage market was simply repulsive. But Edelson laughed, even when she was sold as a wife to a crazy old man, without even putting up resistance. Perhaps that woman was just greedy and sold her youth for power. But for some reason, Laszlo couldn't take his eyes off her. However, it was still destined for them not to exchange a single word. Since, unlike him, Edel was born into an aristocratic family. However, now that same woman served in his house as a maid. The emperor's plan was probably a warning. If Laszlo hadn't accepted her, that woman would definitely have been sold, or simply would have taken her own life. But Edel was left alone in the palace when everyone fled. Count Canyon simply cut ties with his children to save his life. In the end, the Duchess was abandoned by the ducal family and the counts, but it was too late to choose death. Laszlo did not understand that the aristocrats were trying so desperately to save something at the cost of their own lives. Maybe if he keeps her here, she will find a use. The morning of the next day arrived. The housekeeper threw the dirty clothes back into the basket and disdainfully asked the former duchess if this is how they washed at her house. Eden looked at her in confusion. She promised she would do her best to improve. Madame Boyun strictly asked her subordinate Selly if she was teaching her new maid correctly. It was necessary to strictly supervise Edel and teach properly. She was a traitor from the Lancaster house, captured by the count, so she could surely be plotting something. But Selly wasn't sure if problems wouldn't arise later. The housekeeper asked if she was truly afraid of the ghost of the dead duke who would come for his unfortunate wife. Then she laughed and ordered everyone to work. Now Edel understood what the housekeeper meant yesterday. It seems she is trying to assert her authority by trampling the nobility of the former protagonist in the mud. Mrs. Bohun had been behaving this way since the servants were introduced. Surely the housekeeper expected her to collapse. As soon as the housekeeper left, the maid Celia exhaled in relief, which caught Edel's attention. Celia believed this woman was completely crazy when mentioning the dead. The protagonist found out that this young woman was in charge of the laundry, and she supposed she felt very uncomfortable teaching her. Edel decided to finish the laundry before the housekeeper complained again. She first needed to solve what was right in front of her. The protagonist could easily endure ridicule directed at her. However, the problem was completely different. It was unknown how much more her body could endure. In the manner of the Canyon family, a cup fell to the floor with a crash and shattered. Count Canyon started yelling at his daughter, calling her useless trash with no value whatsoever. William asked his father what to do now, since Edel had become the mercenary's trophy. But the Count demanded that useless person not be mentioned. He first had to beg the king to believe that Duke Lancaster was threatening them, forcing them to help in a betrayal. The Duke was keeping her against her will, and as a father, the Count could not refuse. The Emperor deduced that, in that case, he would have no objection to his daughter's fate if he insisted on her innocence. The Count instantly confirmed his words. If Edel was already married, it meant she no longer belonged to his family. Kneeling, Dunstan begged, and handed over not only the secrets of the duchy, but also half of his fortune. Enduring the humiliation, Marco came from the imperial Tuberin house. He became emperor after his useless father. He even attracted commoners to strengthen his power, which means that this treacherous man was willing to do anything. In the end, he turned that useless girl into a dirty toy for a mercenary. The emperor shamed House Canyon to warn other nobles. From the beginning, His Majesty planned to use the great Dunstan to humiliate his entire family. The Count ordered his children to keep a low profile. But Dunstan intended to rise again. Edel went outdoors on a warm sunny day to hang the freshly washed clothes on the line, enjoying the light breeze. Suddenly, someone called her. The protagonist turned around when familiar voices suggested going together. It was Celia and Layla, which deeply surprised the former Duchess, since she did not expect such warm treatment from anyone here. She was on her way, so the girls suggested going together. As a result, they hung all the laundry together. 10 days have passed since the protagonist crossed the threshold of this mansion. And since then, her life has completely changed. Someone might ask what she was doing here. Edel was the banner, and she worked so hard that she could announce it with pride. Thanks to this, the heroine had already gotten used to the clothes. There was only one problem. The head housekeeper, who complained without reason and mocked the former lady. She was always dissatisfied with the laundry. One day, Celia decided to defend Edel. She confidently stated that such a result deserved praise for a novice who had just adapted to this complicated matter. Therefore, the person in charge of the laundry asked the administrator to deal with her matters. The housekeeper tried to protest, but Celia interrupted her instantly. During all that time, Edel observed the argument with amazement and a bit of confusion, unable to say anything. Celia took a dirty towel and proposed to the administrator to try washing it. The woman ran off immediately, but she promised she would do what was necessary to control her. Edel excitedly asked Celia if she was okay. The girl explained that she did it for everyone's good, since the administrator had annoyed everyone with her constant complaints. Still, the protagonist thanked her for her help. Celia promised that in a few days, everything would be resolved. There was a lot of work in the laundry, so the woman in charge of the place asked everyone present to continue. A thought crossed Edel's mind. The maids constantly suffered because of her presence. She didn't even have a chance to talk to them or know their thoughts, so Edel just hoped it wouldn't be too difficult for them. Perhaps the laundresses simply didn't have time to think about anything else. The work was so hard that everyone's hands were covered in calluses. During those 10 days, Count Chrysis did not look for Edel even once, as if he had completely forgotten her at home. Luckily, the protagonist was allowed to live as a simple maid. She was grateful and happy to have escaped the Duke's home. Tomorrow, she would have to work hard again. So the protagonist wasted no more time and immediately got into bed. She wished that the quiet nights would continue, and that tomorrow she would be lucky enough to eat apples. Unexpectedly, Edel heard footsteps approaching her door. It was already late, and the young woman began to fear that the Count had changed his mind. The footsteps suddenly stopped, right in front of her room door, making Edel stand motionless, and her heart beat faster. She asked fearfully who was there. A soft knock was heard on the door. The stranger introduced herself as Daisy, explaining that she lived in the adjoining room, and asked to come in to talk. That girl was the youngest maid in the palace. The protagonist let Daisy into the room, confused. Daisy immediately explained that there was nothing special about her visit, and that she simply wanted to deliver something. It was an ointment and cream for sore areas. Edel asked confusedly why she was giving it to her. The younger maid said that every night she hears her moaning in pain after an exhausting day of work. The walls here were thin, and she lives next door. Also, Daisy heard Mrs. Bajan mocking Edel. The former lady is clearly not used to work, so it's very difficult when everything constantly hurts. That's why Daisy just wanted to give her the medicine. In the world where Edel lived before, nothing was done without a reason. Daisy handed the medicine to the protagonist with a warm smile and held her hand for a moment, showing support. It is surprising that such a young girl can care so much about others. It turns out that pure gazes also exist in this world, and sincere ones. Edel shyly thanked Miss Daisy, and the girl was immediately surprised, exclaiming that she could just call her by her first name. Then, the protagonist also allowed herself to be called by her first name. Daisy shyly asked if she could call her sister. Edel clutched the gifted medicine against her chest. She nodded, and a warm, sincere smile immediately bloomed on her face. A warm and sincere smile. The younger maid offered to help rub her back and shoulders, and the protagonist nodded bewilderedly. If Edel kept a diary, today she would write about her new friend. The next day, as Sally had said, Edel's breakfast was meager, and the person in charge of the laundry was not surprised at all. The portion of soup had been halved, but there was a bun, although she was given fruit. Thanks to Daisy's ointment, made with natural ingredients, and which promised to relieve the pain, the discomfort in her body lessened slightly. Before, Edel was often starved for the sake of her figure, so this was still little. Meanwhile, the Count was reading the new letter attentively. With every new word, the expression on his face became more serious, as if he were immersing himself in his thoughts. He ordered that she be immediately taken to the guest room. The protagonist followed the butler. Edel was surprised by this unexpected summons, but she kept telling herself that there would be people there, and nothing bad would happen to her. The door opened slowly. Only in the morning had the young woman hoped the day would be good. The protagonist, very distressed internally, entered the large living room and immediately reported her arrival to the Count. She asked why she had been called. The Count pointed to the place in front of him and asked her to sit down. Every time the protagonist was in the presence of Count Chrysis, she felt an unbearable feeling of dejection. Edel did not resist and instantly complied with the master's request. Laszlo asked if she knew the widowed Marquise, Barbara Celestine. This unexpected question startled the protagonist, since she was actually friends with the Marquise. But Edel did not understand why he suddenly mentioned that. Laszlo narrowed his eyes and asked again if they knew each other. The protagonist decided it was not convenient to mention that friendship, so she told the Count that they had only had tea together on a couple of occasions. The man supposed the tea must have been very good, since such a proper lady had sent a desperate letter to a mad mercenary. The protagonist asked excitedly and loudly if it was really a letter from the Marquise. Only afterward did she realize she should appear more reserved. The Count's gaze became attentive. He handed the letter to the former Duchess, and Edel, full of emotion, accepted it with trembling hands. In it, Barbara begged the Count not to push Miss Edel into greater despair, since she knew nothing about her husband's plans. When the protagonist ceased to be a duchess, many distanced themselves from her. But it was natural, as the accusations were serious. However, Marquise Barbara sincerely believed in her innocence. And furthermore, she cared deeply, something the protagonist did not expect. Surprisingly, in that place, Edel received kindness. Now she received comfort from an old friend. The protagonist felt sincere relief from her close friend, and that is why she could hardly contain her emotions. However, it was unclear what Count Chrysis would think. He might think that Barbara supports the Duke and the anti-imperial faction. Edel cautiously explained to the Count that there were no ties between their families, and that their friendship was purely personal. So she asked him not to misinterpret the letter. Laszlo assumed everyone already considered him a monster. The protagonist realized in horror that her careless words had hurt the Count. And frightened, she apologized. Laszlo looked at her intently. The Count noted that she was trembling, as if someone's head was being cut off at that moment. Realizing his words, the man understood that he shouldn't have uttered them in front of her. The protagonist, unable to contain her surprise, opened her eyes wide and looked at him intently. She had never before seen such an expression on the Count. Edel couldn't believe she felt guilty at that moment. Laszlo understood that to her, he was only the one who had captured and beheaded the fugitive Duke of Lancaster's first daughter. Perhaps she considered him a cruel monster. The Count did not understand at all how he could have said something like that. He only wanted to know why the widowed Marquise Celestine needed him. But instead, he was too rude. Laszlo did not understand what he was thinking at that moment. The protagonist reread the letter. Then she calmly stated that the Count should not worry about her, since she had faithfully followed His Majesty's order and had achieved victory. But Laszlo did not understand how she could speak so calmly. There was no trace of hatred in the former Duchess. On the contrary, the light of hope still shone brightly in her eyes, and faith in a better future despite all the difficulties and trials of life. Miss Edel was truly worthy of the title of Duchess. In contrast, he had only received the title of Count. That beautiful and cultured woman was nothing like him, who hadn't changed at all since then. Laszlo concluded that he now felt ashamed. He suggested to the young woman that she write the reply herself, because in any case, they wouldn't believe his excuses. The protagonist sketched a happy smile on her face. Laszlo stood motionless for a few seconds, but then he added that she should also include that he would not treat her as society expects. Edel looked at him confusedly. She didn't know what to say, so she simply thanked him. Laszlo was furious about the rumors in society, since he was incapable of such villainy. Having a younger sister, it was too cruel for someone who hadn't even held a woman's hand. Edel was very fragile, like a wounded bird. Although she tried to appear strong, she wasn't. This woman was horrified just by the touch of a common mercenary. So Laszlo promised himself he would never hurt her. Edel pressed the letter against her heart and sincerely thanked him once more. She didn't even notice how shaken the Count was now, returning to the room with Daisy, who was shivering from the cold water. Edel said they worked well today. It seems there has never been hot water in this mansion. Near the door, the girls said goodbye. Upon entering, the protagonist immediately noticed a pencil and paper on her desk and was even a little surprised. So those words were sincere. When Edel asked for paper to be brought to her and a pen, the Count begged her not to hesitate to ask for such things. The protagonist immediately ran to the desk and, with a happy smile, began to think about where to start. But they will probably read the letter, so she cannot write like before. Placing a candle next to it, Edel took the pen in her hands. She still remembered how they met 7 years ago. It happened at Countess Radrick's tea party, when all the ladies were surprised by the arrival of Dowager Duchess Celestine. Edel was intrigued and asked what was happening with the Marquise's arrival. It turned out that the Countess and the Marquise did not get along. The protagonist asked surprised why she was invited, but they didn't give her time to answer. The arrival of Dowager Duchess Celestine was announced. Then Edel saw her for the first time. The woman stopped for a moment, as if assessing the situation, and observed everyone with a penetrating gaze. Before, Edel had not heard the sound of heels. The Marquise limped on one leg, and probably used a prosthesis. The protagonist was horrified, because in that hall, the steps sounded much louder than in others. That's why they invited her. Without knowing their relationship, it was not right to take advantage of her weaknesses. Edel immediately ran to the Marquise. She made up a story on the fly, as if the woman had once helped her in the city with a broken carriage wheel. But the Marquise rejected her gratitude and left without further ado. Barbara looked at the young lady in surprise. One of the ladies commented that the Marquise's generosity was very noble and admirable. Edel eagerly hoped that this scene looked natural. She wanted her excessive enthusiasm to hide the uncomfortable noise. In silence, the Marquise took the young woman by the shoulders with a warm smile and a playful tone in her voice, and affectionately called her insistent one. In her youth, Edel was proud to have helped an elderly lady in distress. Over time, the ladies began to talk about the rumors surrounding Viscountess Oberon, who finally announced divorce to her husband. The main version was that the woman was earning money on her own, but the ladies suspected she was simply having an affair with another man. In society, it is much easier to hurt others than Edel believed. Suddenly, Marquise Celestine placed her cup with a loud sound, with a tone of discontent, and crossing her arms over her chest. Barbara said that gossip nowadays is more malicious than in her time. She asked why the desire to stand out and gain recognition deserved to be criticized. She didn't understand what was wrong with such ambitions. Edel couldn't believe that someone could really live like this, and that it wasn't a mistake. Countess Radric exclaimed that this cannot be compared to how men handle matters outside the home. But the Marquise replied that Mrs. Oberon is a woman who took over external matters that her husband could not handle. Everyone must fight for their rights, not defame others. Countess Radric's friends smiled and assumed that the Marquise sees herself in Mrs. Oberon. Most of those present shared the hostess's opinion. Only Edel agreed with the Marquise. After that bustling tea, the protagonist caught up with the Marquise. She asked if she could ask for a little time. Edel recognized her mistake in daring to pity her, since she didn't know that the Marquise was stronger than everyone present. She wanted to be like her, so she asked to visit her sometimes. Barbara was very pleased to hear that, since she also wanted to continue their friendship. Thus, without realizing it, they became the best of friends. Perhaps the Marquise took care of her more than anyone in the world. If the protagonist had listened to her words then, many things could be different now. Barbara shouted that Edel must get rid of the manipulations of men who wanted to control her. But if the protagonist had not obeyed her father's order, death would await her. The Marquise suggested asking for help, and she would do everything. It was their last meeting. At that moment, Edel's heart felt so much pain and sadness that it felt like a weight of memories was oppressing it. She quietly apologized to Barbara. Mrs. Bogian asked if it was true that the Count had called Edel to him. Mina nodded and said it was during the day in the living room. But the former Duchess left quickly, so nothing serious. But the housekeeper believed that all this was not a coincidence. Even Celia defended the girl. The housekeeper decided that they should not allow Edel, Celia, Layla, and Daisy to rise further. Those shameless ones deserved a lesson. Suddenly, Mina remembered that some servants complained that it was difficult for them to wash with cold water. Rumors appeared, but she denied them all, since hot water was a privilege only for her and Mrs. Bojan. In any case, all the money was quickly recovered by selling the Count's possessions. But the housekeeper ordered them to keep their mouths shut instead. It would be bad if the lady found out. But Mina was sure that she simply didn't care about these things. Boyan smiled disdainfully, as it was the truth. Mrs. Linnea only trusts her, and the Count is rarely at home. This house was practically already under the control of the head housekeeper. It was only necessary to wait a little longer. Edel handed the letter to the administrator. Celia didn't understand when this endless laundry would end, since they were forced to do all sorts of unnecessary tasks. It seems the administrator was dissatisfied again and, without a doubt, was whispering something in Mrs. Linnea's ear. The person in charge of the laundry turned out to be right. Mrs. Bojan proposed an idea to the lady, who approved it since her residence must function impeccably. After that cleaning, Daisy's whole body ached. There was a lot of work, as the administrator complained constantly. The main heroine was surprised to realize that she had been here for more than a month. But she hadn't seen a single guest once. Apparently, it was due to the bad rumors about the Count. Edel also initially thought badly of him. But according to his usual kindness and behavior, that man didn't seem like a bad person. As many might think. Daisy believed that, even without guests. They had a lot of work due to Mrs. Linnea. The youngest maid explained that she now talks to the Count's sister when the lady was in a bad mood. It is very difficult, as she always stuck her nose into the servants' affairs. They say the Count earned well since he was young. Thanks to that, neither he nor his brother ever went hungry. Daisy didn't understand why the young Mrs. Linnea was so simple. If her older brother strived so hard to obtain a noble title. Edel was surprised thinking that. With the Count and the lady, it was as if they were exchanging places. For the first time, she learned to wash clothes in this mansion. Something she didn't know how to do before. It was her first experience living in high society. The protagonist supposed that they probably simply didn't know how to behave like real nobles. It seems the Count showed no interest in the county's affairs. All the power was in the hands of the administrator. Many maids left because of her. But they blamed the young lady for everything. Since the Count gave them good references. It seemed terrifying, but he was a kind person. Edel understood that the Chrysis family had many problems. As long as the authority of Emperor Marcus Tuberino is solid, Count Laszlo Chrysis must adjust to his rank. So, the Count urgently needs to find a good helper as soon as possible. For example, he could get married. In any case, whoever became Count Chrysis's wife. The protagonist hoped that woman would forgive her. The next day, Mrs. Linnea called Edel to her presence. The young woman was interested in knowing what the former Duchess looked like. However, Linnea didn't look much like her older brother. The protagonist calmly reported that she was now simply Edel, since House Lancaster no longer existed. But Linnea replied somewhat irritated, indicating that she already knew that. Edel reflected on the age of that lady and supposed she was about 20 years old. Suddenly, she asked the protagonist how she could have married the Duke of Lancaster, a 60-year-old man. Unfortunately, Edel couldn't choose who she became a wife to. The lady began to be indignant. But a slight smile appeared on the protagonist's face. Without hiding her rudeness, Lady Linnea directly asked the protagonist how she could share a bed with an old man. It turned out the Duke had a mistress. That's why Edel didn't share her bed with him. Linnea was surprised to find out that this mistress managed the Duke's money for the uprising. But now she was probably dead. The Count's sister didn't understand Edel's role in that house at that time. At that moment, our protagonist desperately wanted to prove her worth. If she skillfully managed affairs and fulfilled her task well, she would undoubtedly improve. But Edel was only filling a void so that the family would look perfect. The protagonist mentally called her past self very foolish and smiled slightly. However, the young Lady Linnea did not understand it. Did the blonde also despise her? According to Linnea, Edel was now practically a slave and could no longer pretend to be a respectable daughter of a count. But the protagonist didn't understand why she suddenly got angry. Linnea was outraged that the servant dared to look down on her mistress. She ordered the woman to leave her room immediately. This girl was at the center of the madness that the protagonist had left behind. Fortunately, Linnea could have remained free and kind. For some reason, that girl reminded Edel of someone. She remembers her younger sister. And the moment the girl was crying, convinced that she could no longer bear it, Edel tried to comfort her, but the sister rejected her hand. The protagonist did not expect that at all. According to Lynn, the older sister could endure it, because she was a completely different person, and she had already suffered enough. Now her life was worthless. Edel's younger sister was no longer by her side. Lynn Canyon left, leaving the protagonist alone. The history of House Canyon was not very remarkable, and it began with the great-grandfather who won land and discovered sapphires there. Enriched overnight, He handed a considerable sum to the palace. The imperial palace, which was going through financial difficulties, granted him the title of count as a token of gratitude. They were rich without honor or dignity. One day, Dustin Kenyon ordered his younger daughter to name the 4 main families. But the 10-year-old girl made a mistake. Then the turn passed to the 12-year-old Edel, who answered correctly. These 4 families were so powerful that even the imperial palace considered them equals. The count coldly ordered that this should never be forgotten. It was necessary so that no one would look at their lineage with disdain. Dustin Kenyon exclaimed that they had to marry into one of these lineages. Upon leaving the hall, Lynn asked her sister if she could someday be like her. The girl considered herself too foolish. Edel exclaimed that it wasn't true. But Lynn remembered all her father's words that he had said shortly before. The blonde explained that the father always speaks harshly, but he only wants what is best. Edel took her younger sister's hand. She suggested not talking about it now, and better to go eat delicious cookies, and then study together. Lynn smiled, agreeing with her sister. She liked doing absolutely everything together with Edel. However, the butler ordered them to return to the room. Since from that day on, Miss Lynn was forbidden from eating sweets. All this was an order from Count Kenyon. The protagonist didn't understand how it could be like this. But the butler only coldly asked if Miss Lynn had finished her task for today. The girl replied bewilderedly that she had not. Lauren ran away, saying for the last time to her older sister that she could eat sweets while she did the homework. The father was already strict, but now he is crueler. For some reason, he behaved this way only towards his daughters. But little Edel couldn't do anything or influence the situation. So her soul was heavy, and anger consumed her. She wanted to grow up fast, at least for Lynn. But it was unclear if everything would really be resolved after the marriage. Maybe she would manage to become an impeccable lady. And if she kept striving, an elegant bride. Edel had to be the best bride in the empire. She just had to be fragile and smile beautifully. Then Edel could grant her father the power he had dreamed of since birth. Although she was already 16, Lynn's father kept yelling at her that with such intelligence she would never get married. Her sister, on the other hand, had already debuted in high society a long time ago, and was shown everywhere. The count wanted Lynn to finally be useful too. The protagonist wondered if her sister would be happy with her gift. The white dove slowly spread, and gracefully its wings preparing for flight, like a white angel about to ascend to heaven. Lynn, with bitter tears in her eyes, told her sister that she couldn't take it anymore. She just wanted to fly like a bird. And she did it. The count coldly informed Edel that Lynn had died. The young woman stood motionless. Her heart froze from shock and terror. She couldn't believe what she had just heard. Edel repeated the question, and the count replied, asking in turn if she had become just as foolish. It turned out that Lynn fell from the 3rd-floor balcony while looking out. Therefore, Dustin Kenyon ordered not to tell anyone. The family left, leaving Edel alone. The count was furious about the new problem that fell upon them. Her legs no longer supported her, and she fell to the floor, constantly asking Lynn why she had done it. Edel remembered every time her sister said she found it difficult. Lynn cried incessantly, not knowing how much more she had to endure. The protagonist, who had begun to regain hope after meeting Barbara, sank back into helplessness, and in the end, she got married. In reality, Edel also considered that exit Lynn had chosen. However, the protagonist had someone, and that's why she held on. How could everything be fine for someone who is forced to live an unwanted life, while their true desires are suppressed? Edel could help Mrs. Linnea, but she didn't know if she had the right to intervene now. She closed her eyes as her heart was heavy. But above all, the protagonist was now angry at her own powerlessness. In the afternoon, Count Chrysis returned to the manor. He noticed that not even the administrator came out to greet him, although this manor only served him for meetings with mercenaries. Linnea was happy to see her brother had returned. She knew that today had been a difficult day for Laszlo. The young lady asked what he had done today in the palace. And the count replied by asking why she was interested in that. Linnea said there was no special reason. Laszlo didn't understand why his sister followed him to the room. The man assumed she had something to say. But Linnea replied that it was nothing special. The girl said she had been invited to a tea party. It was organized by Viscountess Emerson. Laszlo told her that if she didn't want to go, she could not go. But Linnea considered it a great opportunity to wear a dress. She was just a little confused, since she didn't know what to talk about there. So Linnea asked her brother to find her a good governess. Laszlo asked his sister if she would promise to study diligently and not show her whims. But the girl asked when she had started being capricious. However, the count demanded a direct answer. He had already found so many governesses for her. But none of those women lasted even 2 weeks in this mansion. But nothing was as they expected. They were the first to laugh at Linnea. These women pretended to be so polite. But in public, they called her the real fool. Linnea endured at receptions. But in the manor, she could scream as much as she wanted. The problem was not the young woman, but the spoiled teachers. But the young lady suddenly remembered that the former Duchess treated her a little differently. The count's eyes opened upon realizing that it was about Edel. Although she had higher status, this woman showed no pride when ordered to kneel. Linnea invited her just for fun. But she was so noble. Laszlo began to yell at his sister, asking if she understood the shameful act she had committed. After all, they always despised those who used power to humiliate others. Linnea knew it perfectly well. But she didn't understand. Could she not act the same way? The aristocrats always looked at her with disdain. So the young woman wanted to do the same, seeing nothing wrong with it. But the count explained that he had not outraged an aristocrat, but mocked a maid. That could truly be called cowardice. But Linnea believed that her brother simply didn't understand anything. She didn't even tell him about the insults she endured so as not to sadden him, although it was very hard for her. Therefore, with resentment in her voice, she called him excessively proper. Linnea hurried towards the exit, saying in the end that she no longer wished to hear from him. The door slammed shut, and Laszlo was left confused and with contradictory feelings after the conversation with his sister. He also didn't know what to do. He didn't even understand what he was doing. All because of the title imposed on him by the snake. The emperor stated that Laszlo must be an example for all mercenaries. And he didn't even understand the meaning of that at first. The mercenaries needed a hope for a bright future. Authority was necessary to protect not only the Calliope unit, but also everything important. Therefore, the emperor had reasons to grant Laszlo such a high title. And he hoped that someday he would accept his destiny. But at that moment, the hero didn't even know what to do with his sister. He thought about hiring another governess from among the guards. But he had to clearly warn Linnea that it would be the last time. Although the count decided to buy her a dress and an expensive necklace, he was also interested in knowing how Edel was doing. He wondered if she was crying alone now. Laszlo began to consider going and apologizing for his younger sister and his horrible treatment of her. But he quickly changed his mind upon realizing that he was thinking too much about that woman. Laszlo immediately opened the terrace doors. His face blushed slightly. But now the young man's mind was clear, since a visit at that moment would cause unwanted rumors. The man with violet eyes took a puff. After Victoria's banquet, the nobility was restless, all because the house of the Duke of Lancaster had fallen so easily. They seemed stronger than the imperial family. But everything fell because of the dirty monster, Laszlo Chrysis. Who could imagine that the imperial family would abandon its pride and grant the title of count to a mercenary of low birth? The emperor seemed to be playing a cruel game. He wanted to make the noblemen suffer. The nobility, however, was outraged by the emperor's decision, and they began to whisper against the emperor. But Laszlo was silent, not understanding why the emperor needed him so much. The Count decided that he should not get involved in politics. He just needed to survive. The next morning, Linnea asked her brother if he had already found a governess. And Laszlo replied that he would look for one today. The young lady smiled because she had already found someone. She had met Edel at the tea party, and she seemed very nice. Laszlo stared at his sister with wide eyes. He didn't understand why his sister liked that woman so much. But he didn't stop her, deciding to go and see the former Duchess himself. He wanted to see if she really was as humble as his sister said. The Count walked to the laundry room. He knocked on the door, but no one answered. And extended his hand to that dirty mercenary. DeMarco Tuberin also arrived from the battlefield. The men proposed to change the emperor. Because if DeMarco remains on the throne, they will fall into decay. But it was not yet time. If the three great families act openly, they will catch them and accuse them of treason. Marquis Tullin became interested in that family that suddenly became rich. It was the County of Canyon. And Duke Baraton remembered that the Count's daughter had been given to that arrogant mercenary. Chrysos, Marquis Bimbler, with a cunning smile, affirmed that the Count was of that class, because of connections, and sold his own daughter. So this insignificant person could lead them to something. The father's demanding voice surrounded Edel everywhere. She opened her eyes wide and understood that it had been a nightmare. Sometimes the protagonist still thought about it, as well as the other members of her family. She wondered if a great fortune didn't bring them pleasure. If they wanted to become nobles so much, they should have donated money to orphanages or hospitals for the poor. But now all that was absurd. The sunny morning turned into a pleasant start to another day. During breakfast, the protagonist heard one of the maids being reprimanded. The woman said, no matter what, that the girl must complete her work on time and not hinder her. But Edel knew that those two worked in different places. However, the protagonist understood that this shouldn't concern her. Noticing that Edel had already finished eating, the person in charge of the laundry proposed that she go. And she agreed. The mansion was quieter than usual because the head maid had left with Mrs. Lin. And that's it. No one wanted to hurry without the administrator. Celia proposed checking it personally. Edel had been there for 2 months, so it would be good for her to inspect the mansion. That's why she will go to collect the laundry herself today. The women themselves decided to take care of what Edel didn't finish yesterday. The protagonist hesitated, but they reassured her. The women remembered that Edel had a bad time yesterday during the conversation with the young lady. So it was a small reward. In the end, the protagonist accepted and promised to return soon. Layla told Sally that she was very nice. It would be very difficult for Edel to deal with all that dirty laundry alone. So the person in charge of washing decided to take care of her. But the protagonist was interested in getting to know the mansion well. The other maids could leave that place at any moment. But Edel would not. She would remain there as a war trophy. She left the laundry room for the first time during such a busy hour. Inside the mansion, cleaning was progressing strongly. Edel understood that Layla and Celia had given her a breather on purpose. So she chose to finish quickly and return to help them. Now, the woman finally felt recognized. Suddenly, Edel saw a maid she had noticed before. The protagonist didn't understand why she wasn't at her workplace. And now she was resting while the others worked hard. She wondered where the maids who should have been there were. Edel knew that a certain faction had formed around the head maid. But it wasn't right to leave the work to others. She wondered if the Count knew about it. It seemed that Edel had no choice but to observe the problems of this mansion. Suddenly, in the adjoining room, she heard male voices. It was the voice of Count Chrysis. And someone else's. The protagonist decided to quickly leave the room before the men discovered her. However, the mercenary heard her. He abruptly opened the door, and Edel froze with fear. The man had ordered the cook not to let anyone in. And suddenly, a determined rat appeared to listen to their conversation. The mercenary began demanding that the woman identify herself. The Count immediately recognized the former Duchess and asked confusedly what she was doing there. Edel calmly replied that she was a regular maid from the laundry workshop. She bowed and explained that she was collecting clothes from Count Chris Sussex's room, and added that she would return another time. But Laszlo replied that it was unnecessary, and simply let her go. The blonde was astonished by his captain's decision. Only afterward did he recognize that face, and realizing that it was the very Duchess of Lancaster. He was shocked, but the man skeptically asked if she even knew how to wash. Count Chris Sussex coldly asked his subordinate if he had ever seen that woman's hands. They were the hands of someone who works hard. It wasn't fair to judge by prejudice and, besides, Edel never received secret messages from her father. Count Canyon. The blonde was surprised that the captain called him by name. Laszlo stood motionless upon realizing. He suggested resuming their conversation, since they needed to carefully watch the red mouse and wait for the appearance of the yellow fox. The Count reported that he now had to go to the palace. Although there were no suspicions, the situation seemed complicated. Edel was not in a position to say anything, so she decided to do whatever she could. The captain approached Lord Milton and asked him if he had finished his training. The deputy commander of the Imperial Knight Order, Edmundo Milton, at that moment met the guard's standards. Even though the uprising of the Duchy of Lancaster was suppressed, no one knows what forces might rise again. Edmundo believed that one must always be prepared. One of the knights expressed his opinion. If it weren't for Count Chrysis, the deputy commander would already be captain of the guard. However, Edmund believed that everyone has their place. In society, the guard that served the king directly was valued more. But both sides also collaborated with each other. The commander suggested that he shouldn't overwork himself, but Edmund considered that he was simply fulfilling his duties. The emperor invested meaning into every action. Therefore, it could be inferred that the appointment of a simpleton and a former thief was also planned. But Edmund did not like the order's reaction. Laszlo decided to dress quickly to hide the scars on his back. He chose a black shirt and carefully began to button up all the buttons. Standing next to his workplace, unexpectedly, he heard footsteps behind the door. Laszlo immediately asked who was there. The voices behind the door introduced themselves as Knights of the Order, and they explained that they had come here to meet the captain of the guard, Terry Bogarton and Gilo Ballin. And Joseph Ose introduced themselves instantly as soon as the Count allowed them in. Laszlo asked what they needed. That might seem like an unexpected request. The Count ordered them to stick to the essentials. So the three knights, frightened, asked for the honor of training under his guidance. The request was truly unexpected. The Count became interested in why they came here to ask for such a thing. The knights were even surprised by the question from the guard commander, since they wished to be as strong as him. But the training sessions at the palace were the same for everyone, so it was easy to fall into laziness. That's why they decided to start training under the guidance of someone strong who could objectively assess their skills. That's why they thought of Count Chrysis. Laszlo was the youngest in the Imperial Guard and was known for his training methods. The knights were also intrigued to find out how the guard trained. From one of them, they learned that the captain always left his doors open for ambitious knights. It wasn't exactly like that. Laszlo never turned his back on anyone. Simply, none of that elite had ever sought the advice of the mercenary captain. But the bodies of these knights were worn out by a bad posture, so Laszlo supposed they wouldn't achieve much. But they had nothing against those who wished to improve. The Count never imagined that the knights would say something like that to him. Laszlo praised such enthusiasm for training and told them he would ask only one question right now. The Count was intrigued why they wanted to do it specifically in his house. It was uncomfortable to train in the palace due to the presence of superiors. The knights considered that it would be a bit strange to train with the captain of the guard while the commander was present. There was always some rivalry between the royal guard and the knights. So it wasn't advisable to generate more tension. Laszlo informed them that they could attend next Saturday at 3. A joyful smile immediately appeared on their faces. Teaching the basics wouldn't be the biggest problem. Count Chrysis did not know exactly how much their physical skills would improve. But the sincere desire to be stronger came at a high cost. The administrator reported that visitors would arrive on the weekend. So everyone had to clean their area carefully. But the maids were not delighted with this. Mrs. Boyan added that the laundry had to remove the winter curtains and prepare the spring ones clean. But there were more than 150 curtains in the mansion. In winter, they took a long time to dry. But the administrator considered that this was not her problem. Furthermore, the laundry was still dealing with dirty clothes. And now it was unknown if their employees could properly receive the guests. Edel did not understand what had suddenly happened with Count Chrysis. A few days later, Laszlo decided not to go to the palace. The count ordered them to go to Grania Street, located in an exclusive district where majestic noble mansions stood. The administrator of Marquis Celestine's residence greeted Lord Chrysis. Marquis Celestine, dressed in his elegant attire, immediately went out to the count and informed him that they could finally meet. Laszlo thanked him for the invitation. The mother of Marquis Celestine immediately approached them. Barbara, with a warm smile, proposed omitting long titles and asked them to call her by her name. Laszlo bowed and mentioned his name, but Barbara knew he was the head of the family, so she decided to call him Count. But Laszlo considered that it would be appropriate to avoid uncomfortable forms of address that might cause awkwardness. Barbara accepted that decision. As expected of a head of the household, Laszlo was a difficult man. In the end, our heroes ended up sitting at the table. Count Chrysis wondered if it was possible to have guests served by a butler. An impeccable service. But he soon concluded that not at all. The Marquise took a sip of her tea and addressed the Count. First the woman, with slight concern on her face, and a voice filled with sincere curiosity. She asked about Edel's health. How could a noble lady easily work as a maid? That was the reason Laszlo had accepted the invitation. A month had passed since Edel's reply. So Count Chrysis supposed that the meeting surely had a specific objective. The Marquis decided to be sincere with the Count, although he observed the Emperor's actions. His mother Barbara wanted to meet Count Chrysis personally. Laszlo had to understand the reason. In high society there were 3 factions. It was the imperialist faction that sought to strengthen the emperor's power, and the old aristocracy, which wished to maintain its influence. The last one was the neutral faction, which had not affiliated with any. The Marquis decided to change position not only for Miss Edel, but also for his desire to better know the emperor and Count Chrysis himself. Laszlo didn't even know if he should be grateful for the attempt at dialogue. Barbara reported that she had read Edel's letter that the Count had sent. Edel did not want to bother others, but surely it was terribly difficult for her to work in the laundry. Therefore, House Celestine could not leave the innocent Edel in such a situation. As long as social rumors do not calm down, she will remain a maid. However, the Marquise was interested in knowing what would happen next, and Laszlo honestly replied that he is still considering it. So he asked her what Barbara was willing to do for Edel. Confusion appeared on the woman's face. Count Chrysis, for his part, maintained a serious expression, awaiting his friend's response. The former Duchess, who now works in his house, Barbara was willing to do whatever necessary. Laszlo replied with a smile, saying they would get along, although love has no age. Barbara, in a joking tone, asked the Count to find a woman his age. The Count was surprised, thinking that Edel could live here happily and in peace. Laszlo was sure that it would be so. The next day, in the Chrysis mansion, the young Mrs. Linnea looked fearfully at the man. She reported that the Count had been urgently summoned by the Emperor, so she would have to serve tea to the guests and show them the house. Linnea did not understand how something like this was possible. Knights would arrive at the house today, but her brother would not be present. But the young woman had never organized a tea party and, at such an important time, Laszlo was not there and she didn't know what to do. Linnea tried to imitate what she had seen before, but she wasn't sure if she was doing it right. She feared they would laugh at her again. But the housekeeper smiled and asked the young lady not to worry, since everything would turn out well. If only there was someone Linnea could trust. She suddenly ordered Edel Lancaster to be brought immediately. This woman clearly knew more about tea receptions than anyone. Edel quickly arrived at the young lady's room, who with evident anxiety asked her to come in immediately. The administrator proposed to the lady that she assign Edel to serve and organize everything. They could show the guests how the former Duchess serves her, which would be quite an impressive spectacle, even though the administrator was in the room. Linnea called Edel, but now Boyan will be able to observe the torments of the Duchess. Linnea knew that work in the laundry was not the easiest. So today, Edel would serve with her. 3 knights of the Imperial Guard will arrive soon, and the brother is delayed, so it's up to them to receive them. But Linnea didn't know if she should receive the guests at the entrance. The butler usually took care of these, but since he wasn't there, the head maid had to receive the guests and lead them to the living room. Mrs. Bohun had difficulty admitting that he understood things well. Linnea asked if she should wait in the living room. The knights had no titles, and since the lady was now performing the duties of the head of the household, it would be appropriate to go down after their arrival. The count's sister ordered Edel to serve appetizers at the right moment when the guests arrived. Linnea was happy when the former Duchess reported that she would immediately go to the kitchen. That meant Edel would elegantly organize everything herself. The protagonist went out into the hallway and immediately clutched her head. She suddenly felt unwell, but she had to hold on until the guests were led back. Linnea looked at the clock and noticed it was almost time. She had to solve it as the sister of the head of the household. Edel entered the room and informed the lady that the guests had already arrived. The girl decided to head out to greet her. However, the maid proposed doing something first. Edel asked for a handkerchief and some powder. Linnea found it quickly and handed it to the blonde so she could act immediately. The count's sister didn't understand what she was doing. The girl had already put on makeup in the morning, and in the mirror everything looked fine. Today for the guests, and Masha had made a special effort. Nevertheless, the former Duchess decided to touch up something else. When everything was ready, Linnea looked in the mirror in surprise. Now she looked much more modest than before, so she ordered Edel to apply more flower powder. However, this type of powder was not suitable for a young single lady. Young ladies only needed to show their natural color. The protagonist tried to explain that creating an artificial blush with such cosmetics would cause rumors. People would start thinking that the young lady wants to seduce men. Lynn froze upon hearing that. Now she understood why everyone looked at her strangely everywhere for applying that flower powder every day. Imasha had said it was fashion in high circles, but Edel grabbed her by the shoulders and tried to calm her by saying everything was fine. Only now Line shouldn't do it. And the Count's younger sister looked at the former Duchess of Lancaster differently. Now is the time to receive the guests. Linnea had to fulfill the obligations of the head of the household. A slight fear was reflected on the young lady's face, but she had no intention of backing down anyway. And she proposed that Edel accompany her. They stopped in front of a large door. Edel asked them not to worry, since aristocrats always followed those who had a higher rank. At that moment, the person with the highest rank there was precisely Linnea. The young woman didn't understand why Edel said that, since she had treated her very badly last time. The blonde was just a maid, like Imasha, who was always nearby. Edel advised the lady to look at the knights from a superior position, showing that she was the one in charge there. That woman's words calmed Linnea. Now she was ready to receive her guests. That same morning, in the office of the first emperor, DeMarco Tuberin was wondering why so many of those who organized the riot were now falling upon him. Begging for mercy, he ordered Count Talon to take care of it. All these men requested clemency, mentioning the late emperor. No ruler received so much love and support from the nobility as DeMarco's father. And people clearly longed for those times. But that emperor was an incompetent ruler. He ignored the corruption of the nobility and only thought of his own pleasures. After his death, DeMarco swore not to become an equal emperor and to pull this country out of its corrupt swamp. He intended to reestablish justice in the country. Rebels should not receive pardon just because they were nobles. There are laws in the empire. And many even supported the tightening of sentences, which undoubtedly pleased DeMarcus. The lack of trained personnel was noticeable. And not even Count Chrysis, who visited the residence of Marquis de Celestin, informed the emperor about it. Few knew the extent of the bond between Barbara and Edel. The emperor asked how his meeting with Laszlo went. According to the informant, the invitation came from the Marquise. And possibly, the Count wished to probe the position of the neutral faction. 2 months had passed since Edel became a servant. It was little time to fall in love, but not enough time to forget it either. The emperor was interested in knowing how the Lord would justify his silence, and whether he would mention Edel's precarious situation. Lady Linnea Chrysis confidently entered the star living room. With a mischievous smile, she asked the knights how long they had waited for her. Then she introduced herself and thanked the men for having traveled all the way to her property. The knights immediately began to praise Mrs. Linnea's beauty. She explained that her brother was delayed due to an unexpected call from the emperor. The young lady immediately proposed that they sit down, and they thanked her in unison, still blushing in her presence. Words flowed spontaneously from Linnea's lips. The door opened and Edel entered the room. The young lady explained that she had specially prepared the tea and the cookies, fervently hoping that the knights would like everything. Linnea was happy with the first tea party in the manor. She looked surprised at how Edel served the tea. The girl couldn't believe that this was the entire banquet. Linnea had introduced the guests in a different way and began to worry about their reaction. But they all looked only at Edel. The protagonist finished her work and headed for the exit. Unexpectedly, a knight said he wanted to wash his hands before eating, suggesting he wanted to leave. Linnea was about to call a servant, but he refused. The knight considered that it wasn't worth calling someone from far away, since they could simply ask that maid. Another knight, along with his companion, offered to go out. Lines wondered, wasn't it rude to abandon the hostess like that? She hoped the knights weren't mocking her on purpose, and mentally begged Edel to return soon. The protagonist asked the men to follow her. Angelo Balin and Joseph Oz quickly caught up with her. They didn't expect to see the beautiful former Duchess of Lancaster so closely. Now Edel understood why they had asked her to guide them. She pushed the knight away from her. The protagonist pointed to the gentleman's bathroom and added that afterward she would take them back to Mrs. Line. The noble behavior of the maid offended the knights. They indicated that she should accompany them to the door itself. Joseph roughly touched the girl's face and said that a simple maid could not disobey the orders of an imperial knight. However, no one was allowed to treat Edel like that. She explained that the Imperial Night Guard is the most respected order under Empress Pispera. However, now the knights, after visiting the head's residence, began to harass the maid. They were currently behaving like real scoundrels. Edel asked the knights to give their names. She wanted to know which families those men belonged to, because their education left much to be desired. Harassing the maid in the captain's house was an evident disrespect. Edel hoped that would be enough. Angelo Balin and Joseph Oz became angry at the words of a simple maid who clearly did not understand her situation. But Edel was one of those people who would not keep silent about such a thing. The blonde was precisely the maid who would not be fired from this house, so she would undoubtedly report everything to the Count. Edel ordered them to stop immediately. or they would be fired. Meanwhile, the atmosphere in the room was extremely tense, and Linnea fervently hoped that Edel would return soon. Joseph roughly grabbed the maid's hand and angrily asked how she dared to speak to him like that. He gave her a chance, but apparently words were of no use. Edel started to struggle, but Joseph ordered Angelo not only to follow her, but finally to silence her. The protagonist looked at him frightened when he ordered her to stay quiet. Time stopped when the knight raised his sword. However, an instant later a knife passed close to him and stuck in the wall, leaving behind a soft trail of cold air. The knights froze immediately. Count Chrysis was heading towards them. Laszlo gritted his teeth in fury, and he asked if that was why she wanted to train so much on his property. Joseph immediately released the maid. The protagonist stood up and greeted the count. Anger burned in Laszlo's eyes. The knights immediately justified themselves, affirming that the woman was the one who seduced them first, and she herself asked to be taken out of there. The count asked Edel what she wanted to do with them. The protagonist did not expect him to ask for her opinion. She replied that they should act according to military law. Although Laszlo did not remember all the details, Edel explained that besides being expelled from the order, they also deserved whipping and paying compensation. There was a case where the captain of the imperial order cut off the right hand of his subordinate knight. Suddenly, the knight shouted that Lord Edmund Milton would explain everything, even though they sought protection from the second in command. Laszlo decided to spare their lives. In the end, they captured the men. Only then did Count Chrysis ask the maid why she had ended up in that part of the palace. The protagonist murmured something in response. Laszlo's eyes opened when he noticed the woman's condition. The count stood motionless for an instant, when Edel stopped holding her legs and lost consciousness right in front of him. He ran towards her, shouting her name. Rumors about the incident in the Chrysis mansion immediately spread among all the servants. Now the housekeeper stood in the middle of the hallway, while Count Chrysis reprimanded her in front of all the other maids. Laszlo did not understand how she managed the mansion at all. The count asked Amashi if she had talked about that woman's status, and the administrator replied that he himself called her a prisoner. The man coldly replied that Edel was a gift from the emperor. The administrator tried to justify herself by saying that all instructions were given by Mrs. Linnea. The main obligation of the housekeeper was to monitor the actions of Count Chrysis's younger sister. If Edel did not recover, Laszlo promised the administrator that the imperial order would take her away. Everyone involved had to remain silent. Imasha couldn't grasp what was so special about this Edel Lancaster. That she was a prisoner sent by the emperor changed nothing. The only thing that mattered was that she was injured in the count's home. Laszlo couldn't afford any more scandals. He ordered the housekeeper to be very careful with the gossip. He had to prevent the noble families from learning about the incident immediately. Otherwise, his political position might be in danger. The housekeeper nodded solemnly. She knew what she had to do. Laszlo returned to Edel's room. She was still unconscious, but now the whole palace was in an uproar because of her. The deputy commander of the imperial order arrived at the residence. He immediately greeted Count Chrysis, whom he hadn't seen for a long time. It sincerely hurt Edmund Milton to have met Count Chrysis in such unpleasant circumstances. Laszlo proposed skipping the greetings and getting straight to the point. The deputy commander reported that, according to military law, harassing a maid implies severe punishment. The knights were sure that the Lord would save him right now. But Milton added that the request was not inappropriate in any way. So the decision was made to expel them from the order. Laszlo smiled mockingly when the knights started shouting that it was unfair. Edmund Milton asked the villains to be grateful that everything ended only with expulsion. Since the commander was shocked, the former knights started begging for mercy at least once. She was just a common maid. Suddenly, Edmund Milton decided to talk about the suffering maid, who had previously been a duchess. He felt like apologizing to her on behalf of the order. Laszlo's face became serious upon hearing that request. The deputy commander reported that he had no bad intentions, and the least he could do was apologize. However, Joseph shouted that all this happened because of Edmund Milton's fault. He himself proposed to the three knights that they ask Captain Chrysis to take them for training. The deputy chief personally said that they could see that woman in the manor, since otherwise they wouldn't have come here. The knights couldn't believe they had been used. They started insisting on their immediate rescue. With a cunning smile, Edmund commented that the captain might misunderstand everything now. He proposed they go and learn from the Viscount. The vice-captain did it because the knights were constantly mentioning Viscount Chrysis. Edmund proposed summoning those who had heard the conversation. As Laszlo suspected, Edmund was inciting those idiots. But without proof, he couldn't say anything. Therefore, the count proposed to the lieutenant that he withdraw, promising him that he would convey the apologies to that maid. Edmund asked with a smile if he needed anything else, but Laszlo replied no, and wished the lieutenant prudence on his return. Turning around, Edmund headed towards the carriage. His face immediately twisted in anger. He didn't understand how that idiot dared to act so arrogant in front of him, when the captain's post should have been his. Edmund was a nobleman who knew the meaning of honor, but his position had been taken by some useless person, and a dirty mercenary. The emperor had been too generous in granting that title to an imbecile. Furthermore, Laszlo had taken a war trophy. Edmund Milton didn't believe that deserved his attention, but now he was deeply interested in it. The protagonist slowly opened her eyes. She didn't immediately understand where she was. Celia sitting next to her. Nervously, she immediately approached Edel when she saw that the young woman had woken up. The protagonist immediately asked how she got there. Celia replied that they would talk about that later, since she had almost died. Then she told Edel that Daisy had been taking care of her before, but now she had come in her place. The count had already sent for a doctor, and Edel found it strange. It would be better if he didn't cure the maids, but gave them hot water instead. Suddenly, the person in charge of the laundry told the protagonist that she was very sorry, surprising Edel. Celia felt that she shouldn't have listened to all those absurd orders from the housekeeper. Then everything would have gone well. Not even when Edel was called to Lady Linnea. She stepped in. Celia believed that attending to the guests was better than dealing with dirty laundry. But the protagonist reminded her that she had already intervened for her numerous times, for which she was deeply grateful. But Celia did it only to annoy Mrs. Bajian. Many maids came and went, but one of the main reasons was always the head housekeeper. Edel, on the other hand, had to endure everything to survive. Celia truly wanted to help her and improve the relationship, but she always thought Edel was no different from the rest. The girl tried to convince herself that the former Duchess could adapt, but the protagonist clarified that it was not so, since she had only found such wonderful friends there. Edel was convinced that only because of them had she managed to resist. Celia took the protagonist's hands. She thanked Edel for those words. The girl proposed to continue taking care of each other, which made a happy smile appear on the protagonist's face. Shortly after, Daisy and Layla joined them. This time, the meal shared with friends felt delicious. If happiness had a taste, it would definitely be as sweet as a piece of fruit Edel held in her hands. The girls kept chatting with each other for a long time. 3 days passed in Chrysis's manor. The head maid had her salary reduced for 2 weeks for neglecting the mess in the manor. Lady Linnea was placed under house arrest. Daisy wished her friend strength and to return soon. Before entering Count Chrysis's office, the protagonist took a deep breath to dispel her nervousness. Then she opened the door. Laszlo turned around upon hearing the sound. He looked intently at the protagonist, and for a moment continued to observe her without saying anything. Silence fell in the room. Edel didn't understand why the count remained silent. Laszlo was furious because they hadn't punished those 2 idiots. The count's anger was understandable. Since they had insulted him, because of a simple maid. So Edel apologized for her behavior. In the world, there were many nobles who suffered because of scandals involving their servants. But Laszlo asked confusedly what on earth she was talking about. The man didn't understand what she could have done then. The blame lies with the head housekeeper and Linny, who could not fulfill their direct obligations. Eldel remembered that Lady Linny was still young and had no alternative. She is too inexperienced to receive guests. It was her first time, and in such an unfamiliar situation. Anyone in Linny's place would experience intense fear and anxiety, since the young lady was not a countess. Laszlo found it hard to believe that he of all people would defend her. The protagonist expressed her wish for the count to be lenient with the young lady, an inexperienced lady. She didn't want him to lose his sister as she once did. Laszlo agreed with Edel's words, because if he had thought clearly, nothing would have happened and no one would have to be punished. The protagonist remembered that the mistake was the knight's, not the count's. The man asked her to sit down and informed Edel that from now on she would work in the kitchen, since the laundry room was not a suitable place for her. Edel was saddened to know she would no longer work with Celia and Layla. Laszlo noticed she wasn't happy. The woman asked if besides that there would be any other punishment, which caught the count off guard, who stood motionless for an instant. The blonde asked uncertainly, "Wasn't it customary in noble families, even if a maid is not guilty? She is punished to protect the family's reputation." Laszlo abruptly stood up and asked her if she considered him foolish. Now the count understood why those idiots were so arrogant. Because they believed they wouldn't be punished. Laszlo could barely contain his anger. He reminded Edel that he was a mercenary, and he didn't understand those noble customs, so she could move forward without worrying about that. At first, Count Chrysis seemed like a cruel person to her. Despite his appearance, this man was probably more sensible than other nobles Edel knew. The protagonist decided to ask the count to allow other maids to use hot water. Laszlo asked confusedly if they really washed clothes in cold water in such cold weather. Edel nodded and added that this also applied to showers. She was surprised that he knew about it. The woman asked in surprise, hadn't he ordered a ban on using firewood for heating? It turned out that Laszlo had ordered everything necessary to be bought because he didn't want to force the maids to use cold water in the middle of winter. Although he had never directly said that they could use hot water, he hadn't even clarified it with the maid. The count realized he was the worst head of the household in the world, and promised that starting tomorrow, he would order everyone to use hot water. With a joyful smile on his face, he thanked Edel. The maid looked at him surprised. A smile also appeared on her face, because she was no longer afraid of him. And now, on the contrary, she found him charming. As Laszlo promised, he ordered the laundry room to be fixed, and the bathroom so that there would be enough firewood until summer. The maids were happy to hear about the arrival of hot water. The protagonist was also happy to see their smiles. Suddenly, the door burst open, and the head housekeeper angrily asked who was standing around doing nothing. According to Bohyan, Edel talked about her well-being without realizing that others were suffering because of her. Thanks to her, two women ended up in a complicated situation. Edel received a promotion simply because the count noticed her. But they were not going to argue with Edel over something so silly. Besides, thanks to her they could use hot water. The housekeeper froze upon hearing that. She learned that the count had recently been to the laundry room and was surprised that they washed clothes in cold water even in the middle of winter. The housekeeper asked them to wait until she herself asked the count. Everyone supposed that the housekeeper liked bathing in cold water, but she replied that perhaps there was a misunderstanding. However, Edel had just heard everything directly from the count. Now they can simply be happy. The housekeeper was furious, believing that Edel had deliberately told the count to undermine her authority. The housekeeper shouted that if Edel spoiled the vegetables, she would not forgive her. The protagonist informed the head chef that she couldn't wait to work with him. The housekeeper was sure that Edel had simply lost her mind. The blonde suspected that the owner of the mansion and his servants had probably been under the control of one person all this time. But Edel was the only one they wouldn't fire, so she could report everything if the need arose. At that very moment, Lynn was sitting in her room. She was sure that Edel had also become disillusioned with her now, since all she had to do was call the servants. As the lady predicted, she would never truly become a noble. Linnea was sure that everything was lost now. The protagonist was called by the person in charge of the kitchen. At that moment, Edel focused, and with a slight smile on her face, carefully peeled potatoes, removing the skin. Lola reprimanded her for not having cleaned the cauldron yesterday. She began to protest when the protagonist reminded her that it was not her responsibility. Edel, with a sincere smile, added that there was no need to cheat, and that the best thing was to fulfill one's duties honestly. She asked Lola not to forget today. Edel had no intention of continuing to be the maid who put up with everything. A moment later, the protagonist sighed in relief at finally finishing her task. She decided to rest a moment before preparing dinner. Work in the kitchen was as exhausting as in the laundry room. Edel began to think more and more that meeting Celia and Layla in the laundry room had been her greatest fortune. But she had to keep striving for her friends. The blonde didn't realize when she fell asleep, and only woke up upon hearing voices behind the door. Mrs. Bohyan asked Bobex joyfully why he was trembling so much. After all, it wasn't the first time, so there was no reason to worry. The man explained that the current atmosphere was unbearable. The woman stated that, in that case, she would find another supplier. However, Bobex promised to take care of everything, and the head maid praised him, saying that with her, he would always have an advantage. The protagonist concluded that they were diverting money. The merchant hesitated to sign the documents, but the head housekeeper's overly confident behavior made her suspect that they were actually stealing money from the manor. Edel decided that this time she would find concrete evidence. She heard the footsteps of the housekeeper, who had already gone upstairs. The head housekeeper probably simply left the receipt in Count Chris's office and left immediately. Laszlo was at work, so the office was empty. Therefore, the protagonist sneaked in. She apologized silently to the Count, although this intrusion was necessary to catch the wrongdoers in the act. Edel quickly found the warehouse receipt. It indicated that all delivered vegetables were top quality. But in reality, it wasn't like that. They took advantage of the fact that they didn't understand varieties in the manor. Edel wondered where the ledger for these schemes might be. People like that always keep records, since they are so obsessed with money that they don't want to lose even a penny. They were probably not only scamming with products. Suddenly, a female voice asked who was there. Young Mrs. Linnea was surprised to see Edel in the hallway. The protagonist froze, as if she were frozen, not knowing how to react to Linnea's sudden appearance. She started frantically thinking what to do. She had to say something immediately. The protagonist calmly greeted the lady, but Linnea rushed towards her and asked her what she was doing there. Edel decided to say only what was absolutely necessary now. She replied that she was worried about her. The protagonist heard that Count Christus punished her for that incident, and he was worried about her condition. The situation was desperate. She was sure that Edel had also been scared. The protagonist clearly remembered the young lady's trembling hands before facing the knights. Linnea replied that everything was fine. She knew that Edel had asked her brother to reduce the house arrest. The protagonist replied perplexed. She only asked and accepted, but no one had ever risked something like that. But Linnea had something else to say. Edel was surprised when she suddenly thanked her. The young lady's face instantly flushed, since she was truly ashamed to utter those words. But they were extremely necessary. To change the subject, Mrs. Linnea suddenly asked if Edel knew Viscountess Emerson. Ed heard it, and the lady commented that she had received a second invitation to her reception. Surprise appeared on the protagonist's face. Angela praised Camilla for the beautiful decoration of the living room. But the woman asked to wait a little longer for the interesting part. She told her that she had invited Mrs. Linnea Crisis. Camilla's thrice removed aunt replied that the celebration would be even merrier. Mrs. Linnea hopefully asked the protagonist if she could become friends with Viscountess Emerson. Mrs. Linnea needs at least one true friend. Edel perfectly understood her feelings. She proposed waiting for the third meeting. Since normally in the first two, people are just getting acquainted. Linnea was happy to have consulted with Edel. She was surprised thinking that with Edel they had already met for the third time. She was dying of curiosity to know what the former Duchess of Lancaster thought of her. Although she didn't dare to ask, Edel explained to the lady that genuine friendship requires time and sincere effort, but when you find a soulmate, you will know. Alinia was intrigued whether she would have one. Then she dismissed her. The next day, before young Mrs. Christus got into the carriage, the maids wished her luck. The carriage left the property. Since neither the lady nor the housekeeper were present, the maids decided to relax. The maids were sure that when the lady returned, she would definitely cause a scene. And in that case, it would be better not to go out at all. Edel was interested to know if Linnea looked good today. After the last tea party, at least she learned how to apply makeup correctly. But the blonde worried that she hadn't seen the dress. The protagonist fervently hoped that everything would go well. Near evening, the carriage returned to the place. The head maid ran into the house and furiously shouted for someone to immediately get out of the hallway. Mina ran out along with other girls. Linnea threw a vase and asked who had left it here. It was already March, but they hadn't removed the winter decorations yet, which could make others think something incorrect. The lady immediately ordered them to look for the gardener. At that moment, the other maids were picking up the pieces. In the end, the young lady simply vented her rage against the maids after they compared her to other people. A brave soul was needed to clean the lady's room. The protagonist raised her hand. Upon entering, Edel instantly noticed the real mess Linnea had caused in her room. But she was not surprised. She carefully cleaned everything. Suddenly, Linnea said she was required to come tomorrow as well. The protagonist stopped sweeping the floor upon hearing Linnea's words and understood that the conversation about tomorrow required her full attention. These people always mocked and ignored Linnea, although they didn't mock her directly to her face. The young woman was beginning to realize that perhaps she was the one responsible for all that. That's why they treated her like that. Linnea hated herself for not being able to answer them. She supposed that Edel also found her repulsive. The protagonist approached the young lady at that very moment. She placed her hand on her shoulder and affectionately called her by her name. Edel was sure that it had been quite difficult for her. Lena nodded and immediately started crying. The lady didn't want to wash her face or go to bed, because the next day they would come again, and she would have to go to that horrible party again. But if she didn't go, rumors would appear. The girl didn't understand why she had to go through this. The protagonist became interested in why Mrs. Cressis continued to accept all invitations, even though Linnea felt humiliated. She always attended those events. They replied that if she refused, her brother would be criticized. However, Linnea was criticized even when she attended, which plunged her into deep despair. The lady didn't know what to do. Edel indicated that the first thing was to restore her reputation. It was very simple, and Edel promised to explain everything immediately if the lady took a hot bath, and then discuss the plan. Angela and Camilla analyzed the absurd behavior of Linnea Christus. They invited her to the reception only to quickly make her understand that she did not belong to the upper world. But Angela believed that Count Christus would not allow it like that. However, Camilla was sure that the silly girl would shine even tomorrow. At this moment, Linnea was taking a warm bath with rose petals that Edel had specially prepared for her. For Viscountess Emerson, that girl was just entertainment. Edel's first piece of advice for Linnea was to pretend that everything was fine, to exhale deeply and enter. The girl was sure that today would be better than yesterday. Linnea was happy to have been able to sit in her place without problems. At the reception, she should focus only on herself and not show at any time that the day's event disturbed her. The young lady had to show herself to be a little more indifferent to the glances of others. Linnea thought about having some tea. At that moment, the musicians began to play their instruments, while the aristocratic ladies started dancing with their partners. The girl felt that everyone was looking at her with disdain. But she constantly repeated to herself that she could handle it. Now that Linnea was drinking slowly, she understood how delicious tea could be. That's why she enjoyed every moment, although she felt disapproving looks upon her. Near evening, two ladies approached the young lady. With smiles on their faces, they informed the lady that the dress suited her very well, highlighting her immaculate taste. In style, Linnea didn't expect it and immediately thanked them for the compliment. According to the ladies, she had even chosen the pearl necklace wonderfully. They proposed that Linnea Chrysis get closer to the one who helped her with today's outfit, and suggested they leave the reception together. At that moment, Viscountess Emerson approached Mrs. Lizio and Mrs. Brungeon and asked if they liked everything at the reception. The ladies replied that they liked everything, even though they were about to leave. Mrs. Emerson proposed to the aristocrats that they stay a little longer, but they refused. Then the Viscountess asked Lady Cressis the same thing, and Linnea replied that she was also thinking of leaving now. Since it was late, the lady asked if she didn't like the reception, but the young woman replied that she had found it very entertaining since yesterday. The noble ladies did not expect such an answer from the young lady, and Viscountess Emerson was even perplexed by those words. The ladies praised Linnea for putting Camilla Emerson in her place. They suggested that from now on, she should always give the same clear answer. But in reality, Linnea said it without even thinking about it. The noble ladies bid farewell to the young lady Cressis, expressing the hope of meeting again soon. Linnea's heart began to beat wildly. Early on, Edel asked who chose the dress and the pearl necklace. Linnea replied that she had done it herself, and the protagonist praised her, saying that she looked very elegant. If the lady wears it with dignity, she will look more elegant than everyone else. The lady had never heard anything like that, and Masha always told her that she was still too young and didn't know how to choose clothes. That's why in high society they would look down on her. But the housekeeper was very wrong. Linnea's taste was much better, and she knew how to highlight her strengths. The protagonist suggested to the young lady that she look at her reflection in the mirror, and Linnea was surprised to see her image. Trusting Edel was the right decision. Our heroine was surprised when at night she was called to the Count's office. The head of the house apologized to Edel for the late call and informed her that starting tomorrow, she would be his sister's personal maid. Edel didn't even know how to react to such news. But there was no one more suitable left in that mansion. Count Chrysis apologized again to the young woman for calling her to his office so late. But Lynn demanded it. Laszlo smiled when Edel replied that there was no problem. He warned his sister that if she caused trouble again, he would not forgive her. Edel saw for the first time such a happy smile on Linnea's face. Count Chrysis used the diminutive when referring to his younger sister, and the protagonist's heart began to race. Now Lynn Chrysis would grow up in this mansion, loved and free. Edel clasped her hands against her chest and mentally begged her sister Lynn Canyon to allow her to take care of Lady Lynn. This time, she will not regret it anymore. These clumsy brothers, but genuinely concerned for each other. They probably supported each other since childhood, like Edel and Lind. Although the protagonist had older brothers, they never exchanged words. They were like strangers to each other. Perhaps that was precisely why. Because after the wedding, they would separate anyway, and would no longer be part of the same family. The brothers even reprimanded her when she didn't want to get married. Now that Lynn was not there to marry in her place, Edel had little time left to accept the marriage with Lancaster. Count Christus informed the protagonist that her room would now be next to Linnea's. It was already night, so the lady promised to show it to her the next day. Laszlo placed his hand on his younger sister's head and stared fixedly at Edel, saying he didn't want to force her. The protagonist understood that this mansion was now her new home. She replied that she would do everything possible, and the young lady instantly took her hand, happy that she had finally accepted. Now that woman was just Edel, neither Lancaster nor Canyon. The maids didn't expect Mrs. Linnea to change so much. It was all thanks to the right makeup. And now the young lady seemed kinder than usual, something the housekeeper didn't like at all. It seemed that Edel positively influenced the lady. Even the Count admitted that Linnea was completely different now. The man also noticed that Edel looked much better than before, and told her directly with a warm smile on his face. The protagonist didn't expect to hear that. Laszlo was sure that it would be easier for him to talk to Barbara now. Edel called the Count, and he blushed immediately. The man quickly decided to change the subject and proposed to the young woman that they resume their conversation from yesterday. He decided to install a sofa there and a table because at that moment they had nowhere to sit. Having helped his sister, the Count decided to thank her personally. The protagonist replied that she did it not for a reward, but that the promotion was already enough thanks. However, Laszlo knew that with his sister it wasn't simple at all, so he asked her to accept at least this. Compared to what Edel did, this is insignificant. The night before, Linnea burst into his office and started begging him to give her Edel, which left the man bewildered. The girl explained that she was the one who dressed her. Laszlo stood motionless when she told him that, for the first time, she hadn't been ashamed. Now the man understood why it had always been like this. Count Chrysis believed that, being so sincere and cheerful since childhood, she would adapt easily to the unfamiliar aristocratic world. He left her alone, fully trusting in it. Perhaps they could never get close again. Therefore, Edel became her savior. The Count was not sure that the gift he had chosen would please the former Duchess, so he asked her to accept a check. Edel replied with a hint of sadness that she didn't need it. Laszlo was surprised by such an answer. After all, she could at least buy herself new clothes and some nice jewelry. He reminded her that she couldn't leave the manor. Graf asked perplexed how it was that she couldn't leave. He was left speechless when he realized that Edel had always considered herself a prisoner and a maid in this house. But it wasn't like that. Laszlo had said from the beginning that he was taking her as a maid. Edel was supposed to receive the same salary as the other maids, and the Count had already started thinking that this wasn't happening. But Edel replied that she was paid. And then Laszlo said that then she had no need to lock herself up in this mansion. The protagonist still couldn't believe it. Her face flushed intensely, and her heart began to beat faster. Laszlo had always thought Edel was tough, but she had a soft side, and Lane's help was an example of that. But in reality, at first the protagonist struggled to hint at Lane's problems. She didn't know how to calm her heart that was beating wildly. Edel made a resolution and informed him that she would prefer not to receive money. The protagonist begged them to believe her, assuring them that her words were sincere. Laszlo immediately replied that he trusted her and urgently asked her what her wish was. But it was nothing more than a favor. It was not necessary at this moment. She only wanted Count Chrysis to always trust her words. And the man agreed. Linnea, happy, showed Edel the invitation for another reception. The protagonist wholeheartedly wished her the best congratulations. The young lady announced that the adjoining room was now ready, and Edel could move her belongings and start working the next day. Linnea retreated to her room, murmuring a melody. However, before closing, the housekeeper's hand prevented the closing. The young lady turned around sharply and asked scared who was there. And Masha entered the room, and she assumed that today the lady would find it uncomfortable not having her, since she was the one who was supposed to take care of her. The housekeeper took out a new floral powder but Linnea snatched it from her hands and shouted that she didn't need it. The young lady angrily asked the housekeeper if she thought she was a fool for having let her go like that. Without further ado, and Masha exclaimed that that powder had been recommended by maids from other houses. But Linnea didn't want to hear anything and ordered the housekeeper to leave her room. The head maid went out into the hallway and squeezed the apron with her hands in rage, since it was all that damned Edel's fault. However, this was not going to end there, and Masha was not going to let it go. Daisy said with tears in her eyes that now even her little sister was leaving her so far behind, which she needed a lot. One might think that Edel disappears completely, but the blonde was happy to see Daisy so sad. The protagonist admitted that she felt a little uncomfortable living alone in such a nice room. But her friend replied that it had to be that way, since even Mina always had a nice room, although she never had a position. The administrator assigned rooms according to her preferences. Edel decided to take advantage of it as a test. Daisy was interested to know how Edel planned to decorate the room, since now it is fashionable to hang small portraits on the wall. They say the artist's street is very popular. In reality, Edel had never considered it. The protagonist proposed they go to that street together next week, and also buy something delicious. Of course, Daisy did not object. Edel was happy and wished every moment would be like this. But one day, Lady Linnea couldn't find the pearl hairpin she wanted to wear that day. The blonde supposed it might be in the black box, but it wasn't there, and Linnea started thinking she had put it somewhere else. The protagonist said she would check the other boxes, and the young lady suggested doing it together. When they started searching, they discovered that the boxes had many empty spaces. Linnea was sure that the other chains were still in them. And the gold necklace. If only the hairpin had disappeared. Her carelessness could be blamed. But now it was clear theft. The young lady immediately ordered everyone to gather. Linnea and Edel went down to the first floor. The administrator reported that she had gathered all the servants by order of the lady, since everyone should help find the criminal. Masha pointed out 3 maids who were rotating cleaning in the ladies' room. Besides them, there were also Masha and Edel. Linnea ordered all the rooms of these maids to be searched, but the administrator reported that they would also search the rooms of others just in case. According to Masha's logic, the ornaments could be hidden in their friends' rooms. Edel informed the lady that it was unlikely they would find anything in the rooms. Linnea understood that her ornaments had probably been sold, although at that moment she considered other possibilities. For justice, everything had to be clarified. Edel was happy with the lady's good intuition. Sometimes she was too temperamental, but with the right education she could improve. The administrator ran into the hallway and happily announced that they had found the culprit. The maids immediately started whispering. The protagonist was speechless when the head housekeeper pointed her finger and stated that she was the culprit along with her maids. The jewelry was found in Daisy's rooms. Sally and Layla. The girls were horrified by such a declaration. The maids exclaimed that there was a mistake, since they didn't even know what the young lady's room looked like. The girls fell to their knees and proclaimed that it was clear slander. Linnea herself understood that it was truly strange. The administrator recalled that those 3 were close to Edel, and the common maids didn't have enough money, so it was a legitimate motive. So Edel stole the jewelry and gave it to her friends, and Masha exclaimed that there was no other way it could have developed. The administrator was about to leave for a moment, so everyone could return to work, including Celia, Daisy, and Layla. The administrator didn't understand where they were going. Upon returning to her room, Edel asked the lady if she believed in her guilt. Of course, the administrator didn't believe it, but she was intrigued by how Edel managed to remain calm in such a difficult situation. Perhaps precisely, that composure was the trait of a true lady. But Edel didn't know the correct answer. The protagonist explained that at that moment, she felt no resentment, but rather thought that the time had finally come. but Edel needed clear proof of her innocence. However, the protagonist fully trusted her own strength. She promised Lady Lenny that she would be able to prove it, thus redeeming the young lady's trust in her. The Count discovered that while he was away from the palace, an incident occurred. Edel decided to tell him everything she knew. Laszlo gave her permission to do so. The protagonist wondered if the Count remembered how she had begged him to trust her words instead of his empty promises. Of course, Laszlo remembered, and he believed in her innocence. But it wasn't about theft and, of course, Edel had stolen nothing. The real problem lay in the content of the documents that the protagonist drafted according to what she had seen and heard. The details had to be verified with the Count's books. Edel requested an official investigation in the name of Count Kritsis and the Kritsis line. Laszlo asked Edel if this had to do with the head housekeeper accusing her of theft. The protagonist nodded and added that, because of her, Amasha could no longer manipulate Mrs. Line or control the servants as before. Daisy, Celia, and Layla suffered because she wanted to get rid of everyone associated with Edel. They were assigned the hardest jobs because they couldn't pay the fees. Edel was expecting precisely this moment. Knowing how Laszlo Kritsis was, he had surely noticed oddities on the estate. And Edel hoped their testimonies would confirm her suspicions. But she wasn't sure if he would believe her. Laszlo smiled and said it was all her fault. The main heroine asked surprised if he truly believed her weak arguments. But the Count remembered that he himself had promised to believe her. He felt that Edel would not talk nonsense, nor belong to those seeking material gain. This woman was a valuable person who opened Laszlo's eyes. However, the man asked for something in return. With a smile on his face, he asked the former Duchess of Lancaster if she was prepared for the future consequences. Finally, the accountant was arrested. And the merchant. The woman kept shouting that she was not guilty of anything. Count Kritsis coldly ordered the former head maid to immediately explain what and how she had diverted. But Amasha shouted that she was not guilty of anything. Although according to the records found by Nathan, Amasha was buying cheap products. She presented them as top quality. In addition, she increased the price of expensive things. She benefited by buying the cosmetics and the ladies' dresses. According to the fake accounting books, the total stolen amounts to approximately 250,000 linten. Amasha shouted that it was difficult to manage the fiefdom. She had worked so hard for 3 years, so they could turn a blind eye. The Count offered her 2 options: go to jail or sign a document for 400 coins. Amasha was left speechless, since the amount stolen was much smaller. But the rest was compensation and payment for her life. Now, the former administrator had to choose. Daisy excitedly asked Celia's sister if this meant that all false accusations against them had been dropped. The girl nodded and said that now there was no reason to worry. However, another problem arose. Now the position of head housekeeper was vacant, and it had to be decided who would occupy it next. Linnea didn't understand how they had lived with such a housekeeper. Laszlo agreed with his sister. Then he pointed out that, for example, the one who exposed all of Amashi's crimes could occupy that post. From now on, Edel will be the head housekeeper. Lady Linnea could not contain a satisfied smile. The protagonist's friends were thrilled to hear the magnificent news, and were sincerely happy for Edel. Laszlo immediately asked if anyone had objections. After the storm, an almost overwhelming silence took over the estate. The guilty parties hurriedly left the property, and the innocent occupied their posts. It turned out that Amasha housed the poor maids in horrible rooms, while knowing that there were many good vacant ones in the mansion. The friends decided to help Edel as soon as they finished moving. The duties had to be reorganized and hire new people. Who would have known what would happen if someone else had been in Edel's place? Even though there is chaos on the estate for now, just the fact that Amasha finally disappeared felt better. The protagonist cracked open the door when she heard a characteristic knock. Count Chrysis apologized for the late hour. Edel was so surprised to see Laszlo that for a moment she forgot all her words and looked at him stunned. The man apologized and asked permission to enter, after deciding to dismiss the head housekeeper, Imasha, for several days. The Count's mercenaries searched the related companies. They managed to find hidden double account books. It turned out that Imasha did not keep any of the books correctly. And now it was up to Edel to start managing the house from scratch. But in that manner, without a housekeeper. She didn't know how far she could go. A knock was heard on the door, and Edel thought it would be her friends. It was surprising how many people visited her now. And if Edel had told this to someone 3 years ago, she wouldn't have believed it even as a joke. It turned out to be Count Chrysis. She immediately stammered excitedly so that he wouldn't think something like that. But Edel wasn't even thinking that. The protagonist allowed the man in and apologized to the Count for not even being able to offer him anything to eat at that moment. The man calmed the woman and told her that thanks to her, the line had become much cheerier. Invitations were now constantly arriving. Edel, with a warm smile, explained that it was all thanks to the cheerful nature and energy of the young lady. Laszlo replied that she had always been like that, but he simply didn't understand it. Everything he couldn't give his younger sister in the last 3 years. Edel managed to change in a few months. Finally, the long-awaited peace arrived. No matter how much Laszlo thanked her, it would never be enough. The man explained to Edel that he wanted to keep asking for her help, not as Count of Chrysis, but personally. Being born as the sister of a brother like him was not Linnea's choice. Even if Edel hated and despised him, he asked her to take care of his sister. But the protagonist replied to the Count that she didn't see it the way he thought. Rather, he himself didn't want such a trophy. And it would have been better if the Count had gotten a work of art or a jewel. However, Laszlo replied that the Emperor had given him the most valuable person. Edel looked at him surprised. She thanked the Count for those words. Then, the protagonist murmured that nobody believed that the wife of a traitor would dare to survive. If the Count hadn't taken Edel as a maid, she probably wouldn't be alive anymore. The man knew it was very difficult for Edel. However, if she continues living, sooner or later good days will come. So she shouldn't think about death anymore. Edel agreed with those words. Tears began to well up in her eyes. The protagonist was always told that she should control her emotions and hide her true feelings. She wasn't allowed to show her weaknesses so easily. However, now she cried without trying to hide it, and said that she only wanted to live a completely normal life. Laszlo took a handkerchief out of his pocket. The protagonist immediately accepted it. The man didn't judge her for showing weakness in front of him, since he supposed that being normal for her was very difficult. He wondered what else could happen if Edel showed her tears again to someone who had already seen her weak. But a warm comfort emanated from the fabric he handed her. Edel really wanted to live a normal life. A common family, love and friendship had always been the most difficult dream for her, and unattainable. She decided to wash the fabric and return it tomorrow without fail. In the end, Edel slept the whole night without dreams. In the morning, she had to get up and eat, since starting today she would have many tasks due to the new position. The administrator redistributed the tasks according to the maid's wishes, until new maids arrived. It would be difficult, but the protagonist hoped that everyone would work with effort and new enthusiasm. Mrs. Linnea also wanted to say something. The lady confessed that she had been very nervous about the responsibility all this time, even when Masha manipulated them. Linnea apologized to the maids for causing them so many problems. Now her main goal will be to manage Chrysis Castle without shame. With Edel's help, they could strive now. Then, the young lady apologized to Edel's friends for not being able to clear the false accusations against them sooner. But the girls were happy they could stay in this castle. The maids thanked the lady for the new rooms. Linnea laughed happily as she was pleased and very hopeful for everyone now working in her home. Now the Chris's house started anew. After so much tense time, the promised day off from Daisy finally arrived. So much had happened in those days. And finally they could rest. And Edel was happy to have kept her promise. They went out onto the street, where even aristocrats were strolling. Daisy asked her sister if she wanted to go into somewhere. The protagonist explained that she had seen a clothing store and thought she needed to buy everyday clothes. Daisy, with a smile, suggested going there first. The protagonist froze as soon as she heard her name from passers-by. Edel stopped and noticed a dark-haired aristocrat looking at her, surprised at that moment. It was Lady Lucille Arton. The aristocrat immediately called her friends to introduce them to Edel. Daisy started to worry. But the protagonist explained that everything was fine, and that they just had to greet them and leave. Suddenly, a man asked if a criminal could even be on the street. Edel was wearing a beautiful dress, and they started thinking that she had stolen it. If the former Duchess had even an iota of shame, she would already be buried with the other traitors. Many people in Edel's position would have preferred a dignified death. The protagonist calmly replied that Count Crisis had given her permission to go out. So she asked them to leave her alone. These people were no different from a Mashi. They just wanted to cause pain and see others' tears. So the important thing was not to fall for their provocations. Edel bowed and wished them a pleasant walk. However, the men said disdainfully that it was obvious she was that mercenary's mistress. That's why she behaved with such confidence. It was to be expected, since she started calling that commoner. Count Edel wondered if she should endure these offenses. Count Crixus suddenly appeared and said he didn't even know he had a mistress nearby. The aristocrats fell silent instantly, surprised by the unexpected appearance of the guard captain. Edel didn't understand why Count Crixus was here now. Not only Edel and Daisy came to this street, but also the Count and his sister decided to visit the street food area. Since Laszlo became a nobleman, he ate overly refined food. But precisely, this food suited him better. Linnea suddenly decided to ask if it was true that they had become orphans 16 years ago. Laszlo was surprised by the question, but the young woman explained that she was intrigued how one child could take care of another child. He replied that they survived as best they could, but Linnea insisted on not evading the answer. She didn't clearly remember the house where they lived as children. The faces of their parents, of course. They had long disappeared from her memory. Linnea had already moved quite far away, so she wanted to know more about her shared childhood with her older brother. It turned out they used to live in a cozy house. And happy, but that everyday life collapsed in an instant. Laszlo ran at full speed through the forest with his little sister on his back, who was crying and calling for her parents. The boy promised he would protect her at all costs. They could be caught by children at any moment, so they had to keep running while they still had strength. But his arms could no longer bear Linnea's weight. If they found a safe place where they could stay together, everything would be much easier. At dawn, a bright glare suddenly blinded Laszlo. The grandmother, who days before had given them meat pie, found them and asked if they had been hiding there for several days. A kind woman proposed going with her, perhaps because of the days spent fleeing. But Laszlo instinctively sensed that he could trust her. The grandmother explained that they lived as a couple with her husband, and that they would love to take care of someone. For Laszlo, he did it in search of a safe future with Linnea. Now neither the name nor the past mattered. So the children were able to forge their new world, safe and full of joy. When someone appeared who would take care of Linnea, Laszlo started going out to earn a living. And little by little, he dedicated himself to sword practice. Those elderly people took care of the people with affection. And in their home, the children were truly happy. Linnea remembered the grandfather well. And the grandmother. She supposed that her brother also didn't remember their parents. And the man replied that, although small, they had a very good house. Although Linnea didn't remember her parents' faces, she would never forget the taste of grandmother's meat pie. However, Linnea's current house was also starting to please her. Now she proposed going to take a look at the other side of the bridge. And so, traveling all this way, the heroes met their companion lady, whom they were insulting in front of everyone at that moment. On the faces of the brother and the sister, anger immediately appeared. They didn't understand how anyone could say something like that about Edel. The aristocrats were sure that a woman who agreed to marry an old man was very dangerous. Laszlo couldn't stand it anymore. He immediately asked furiously what they thought they were. At that moment, 4 scoundrels were spreading dirty rumors about something they absolutely didn't know. The men reported that the guard captain could not threaten people. However, Laszlo considered that he was behaving quite courteously for a mere mortal. He reported that Edel was an important member of the Count's family and demanded immediate apologies for the slander against her. Laszlo asked Edel if she remembered the names of all the aggressors. The ladies and gentlemen immediately apologized to the Count and promised it wouldn't happen again. The guard captain did not wish to complicate the situation, but he didn't know how Edel would react. So the aristocrats bowed to the protagonist and apologized to her. Edel's eyebrows furrowed, but she still accepted the apologies of the ladies and their escorts. Those hurried away. The young lady was deeply indignant at the behavior of the nobles who dared to slander Edel. Suddenly, Daisy ran into her father. Edel told Line that they came to have a portrait taken with Daisy. And suddenly, they saw familiar faces. Line also wanted to have a portrait taken with her brother. She explained that he spends all his time at war, and you never know when he might suddenly die. The young lady did not want to forget the people she cared about again. For her family, this concern was natural. But the young man now understood how tense Line got every time he left. Although Laszlo considered himself a failure, he shared something with Edel. The most difficult thing was leading a normal life. Daisy was surprised to learn that Edel had already agreed with someone to go, since she didn't hear the beginning of the conversation being far away. The artist greeted the guests. Normally, an aristocratic portrait takes more than a month. But the Count heard that here, they paint quickly with cake. The commoners started drawing portraits imitating the aristocrats. The protagonist supposed that now the aristocrats wanted quick portraits. And cheap ones. Of course it was good that they decided to paint a portrait. However, this image of the older brother, Linnea considered it inadequate because he needed to shave and comb his hair. Edel told Daisy that she would pay for the portrait herself. An artist approached the brother and the sister and requested permission to guide them. The ladies would be attended by a student quite skilled in his work, so there was nothing to worry about. Daisy did it for the first time, so she was nervous. Edel suggested they imagine they were just resting together. The protagonist had only painted her own portrait once in her entire life, and that was after her wedding to the Duke of Lancaster. But that one had been burned a long time ago, so this would be Edel's only portrait. After some time, everything was ready. The young artist was surprised by Edel's beauty and suggested she become an actress, but she rejected the idea. But the boy insisted because with that appearance, all tickets would sell just for her presence. Laszlo touched the artist's shoulder and coldly asked him to paint another portrait. The Count wished for his coachman Marco to paint him next to his daughter. Suddenly, Laszlo commissioned the host to paint another portrait, in which Edel would appear separately. The protagonist was surprised by such a request. The man explained to Edel that Duchess Celestine often asked about her, so he decided to send the portrait. The blonde thanked the man for taking such good care of her. Edel never dreamed of meeting Barbara. She thought she was already quite happy with her life. But it turns out it could still be better. Today was a really good day. The Count proposed that the girls return together in the carriage, but they refused, claiming they wanted to buy something else. The Chris's family wished them enjoyment of their free time. Edel proposed continuing to explore the shops. Laszlo was happy to be able to draw a portrait with Linnea and make a worthy gift for his faithful Marco. He even managed to paint a portrait of Edel. He should send it to Duchess Celestine to show that his friend was doing well. However, Laszlo didn't feel like doing it at all. So he decided to postpone it for the moment. He justified his decision by saying it would be strange to send something like that without warning. After a weekend full of events, new servants selected by Nathan arrived. Since Edel became the administrator, it was necessary to find a personal maid. And she proposed it to her friends. But they refused. So, among the new ones and the existing servants, the protagonist selected 2 suitable candidates. Then she found another suitable person. Edel proposed separating the things to be thrown away and what could be sold. And Daisy asked if she could do it. The protagonist asked her not to worry, promising to help her and explain everything. Daisy, with bright eyes, she promised she would try, since the young lady will meet different people. Daisy's kindness will help in shaping her character. Daisy has exclusively been talking to people much older than her until now. The protagonist hoped they would influence each other well. Despite the status difference, Edel reported that after lunch, a tailor would come to them. As the administrator announced, a seamstress from the Anami's house arrived shortly after. Linnea wanted to order 3 outfits, specifically a dress for walks, 1 for picnics, and 1 evening dress. The woman proposed choosing from the catalog and taking measurements immediately. Linnea asked the administrator for advice, and the seamstress only confirmed the rumors that Lady Crisis relies on the housekeeper for everything. It means any dress can be sold dearly. Linnea liked a dress. However, the seamstress suggested looking at another option. It was a new design for a youthful dress, very popular among girls her age. Linnea doubted the woman's words. Edel understood that the tailor was trying to get rid of unsellable items. The woman decided to propose a white muslin dress, but Linnea abruptly closed the catalog. Since it wasn't necessary, she decided to order only the dress she had chosen previously. The tailor asked confusedly if the lady wasn't going to order 3 dresses, but Linnea decided to do it later. The Count's sister asked if her taste was really that bad. The woman let out a forced laugh and proposed taking the measurements. Now Linnea could handle it perfectly. She was quickly regaining her lost confidence and continued to study well. Edel decided to be present during all this. Linnea successfully completed her first sale. The young lady pointed to another item and asked the merchant to include it in the total. Linnea told Edel that it was a gift for her. The protagonist was surprised and asked the young lady if she hadn't perhaps bought it for herself. Linnea replied that only those who work hard should wear such things. The merchant was known for being a rumor spreader, so telling it now would improve Linnea's reputation. The merchant considered the lady careful and a good business partner. Edel was indifferent to rumors, since she only wanted to give the gift to Edel. The protagonist accepted it and thanked her lady, to which Linnea asked her to use it well. Now Edel possesses another precious item. The protagonist's room was filled with gifts and letters from dear friends. She decided to write it down in today's diary. Last weekend she and Daisy bought diaries and galanterie, since in addition to daily entries, Edel wanted to make personal notes. She wanted to record all those countless memories being created in this mansion. Suddenly, Linnea burst into the room. Milady took Edel's hand and told her she had a request. Completely unexpectedly, she asked the protagonist to take care of her older brother, Count Crixus. Edel's eyes widened enormously in surprise. This story happened the same day at noon at the Brunchen mansion. Lady Linnea once again complimented her beautiful appearance, and the young lady immediately thanked her. Linnea also complimented Jeremiah Bruinen, who invited her for tea. Mrs. Crixus introduced herself to the granddaughter of Duchess Bruinen. There were no unbearable people in this place. At other parties, there were still those who looked at her with distrust. But here everyone was kind. Suddenly, the lady asked why the Count didn't attend the parties, and Linnea replied that he was very busy. One of the young women admitted that the Count looked a bit intimidating. She asked Linnea not to misunderstand him, since it is up to him to look imposing, like a knight of his rank. The lady meant that the Count seemed unapproachable. Miss Linnea could help her brother. It was also time for him to get married. They say the truth is more evident when there is no malice in the words. And now Linnea understood that the real problem was not with her. Most aristocrats judge a person by their appearance and their connections. Even Linnea couldn't handle her brother's stubbornness. So the young woman asked Edel to help her brother change, so that he could finally get married and have normal friends.